Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, sometimes referred to colloquially as National Airport, Washington National, Reagan National Airport, DCA, Reagan, or simply National, is an international airport in Arlington County, Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. It is the smaller of two airports operated by the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority that serve the National Capital Region around Washington, D.C. to the west in Virginia's Fairfax and Loudoun counties. The airport is 5 miles from downtown Washington, D.C., and the city is visible from the airport. The airport's original name was Washington National Airport. In 1998, Congress renamed it Ronald Reagan National Airport in honor of President Ronald Reagan. MWAA operates the airport with close oversight by the federal government due to its proximity to the national capital. Flights into and out of the airport are generally not allowed to exceed 1,250 statute miles in any direction non-stop, in an effort to send coast-to-coast and overseas traffic to Dulles International Airport, though there are 40 slot exemptions to this rule. Planes are required to take unusually complicated paths to avoid restricted and prohibited airspace above sensitive landmarks, government buildings, and military installations in and around Washington, D.C., and to comply with some of the tightest noise restrictions in the country. Reagan National currently serves 91 non-stop destinations and is a hub for American Airlines. The airport has no United States Immigration and Customs facilities. While technically an international airport, it is used predominantly for domestic flights, with the only international being to and from those with U.S. Customs and Border Protection pre-clearance facilities, including major airports in Canada and from some destinations in the Caribbean. International passenger flights to and from the Washington, D.C. area utilize Washington Dulles International Airport or Baltimore Washington International Thurgood Marshall Airport. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were 5 scheduled international routes to cities in Canada, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. Bermuda has yet to be resumed as of October 2022. The airport served 23.5 million passengers in 2018. In 2019, DCA served 23,945,527 passengers, an increase of 1.8% over 2018, and a new passenger record for the airport. Early life. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born on February 6, 1911, in an apartment on the second floor of a commercial building in Tampico, Illinois. He was the younger son of Nell Clyde and Jack Reagan. Jack was a salesman and storyteller whose grandparents were Irish Catholic immigrants from County Tipperary, while Nell was of English and Scottish descent. Ronald's older brother, Neil Reagan, became an advertising executive. Reagan's father nicknamed his son Dutch, due to his fat little Dutchman appearance and Dutch boy haircut. The nickname stuck with him throughout his youth. Reagan's family briefly lived in several towns and cities in Illinois, including Monmouth, Galesburg, and Chicago. In 1919, they returned to Tampico and lived above the H.C. Pitney Variety Store until finally settling in Dixon, Illinois. After his election as president, Reagan lived in the upstairs White House private quarters, and he would quip that he was living above the store again. For that period, which was long before the civil rights movement, Reagan's opposition to racial discrimination was unusual. He recalled the time when his college football team was staying at a local hotel that would not allow 2 black teammates to stay there, and he invited them to his parents' home 15 miles away in Dixon. His mother invited them to stay overnight and have breakfast the next morning. Reagan's father was strongly opposed to the Ku Klux Klan due to his Catholic heritage, but also due to the Klan's anti-Semitism and anti-black racism. After becoming a prominent actor, Reagan gave speeches in favor of racial equality following World War II. Later, as a politician, Reagan was often accused of appealing to white racial resentment and backlash against the civil rights movement. One example was during his first campaign for governor of California, Reagan's platform included a promise to repeal legislation barring housing discrimination. Certain in his own lack of prejudice, Reagan responded resentfully to claims he was racist while defending his position, arguing, if an individual wants to discriminate against Negroes or others in selling or renting his house, it is his right to do so. He believed that the right to dispose of and control one's own property is a basic human right. Religion. Ronald Reagan wrote that his mother always expected to find the best in people and often did. She attended the Disciples of Christ Church regularly and was active, and very influential, within it. She frequently led Sunday school services and gave the Bible readings to the congregation during the services. A firm believer in the power of prayer, she led prayer meetings at church and was in charge of midweek prayers when the pastor was out of town. She was also an adherent of the social gospel movement. Her strong commitment to the church is what induced her son Ronald to become a Protestant Christian rather than a Roman Catholic like his Irish father. He also stated that she strongly influenced his own beliefs. I know that she planted that faith very deeply in me. Reagan identified himself as a born-again Christian. In Dixon, Reagan was strongly influenced by his pastor Ben Hill Cleaver, whom he considered a wonderful man. Cleaver was the father of Reagan's fiancée. Reagan saw him as a second father. Stephen Vaughn says, at many points the positions taken by the First Christian Church of Reagan's youth coincided with the words, if not the beliefs of the latter-day Reagan. These positions included faith in providence, association of America's mission with God's will, belief in progress, trust in the work ethic and admiration for those who achieved wealth, an uncomfortableness with literature and art that questioned the family or challenged notions of proper sexual behavior, the presumption that poverty is an individual problem best left to charity rather than the state, sensitivity to problems involving alcohol and drugs, and reticence to use government to protect civil rights for minorities. According to Paul Kengor, Reagan had a particularly strong faith in the goodness of people. This faith stemmed from the optimistic faith of his mother and the Disciples of Christ faith, into which he was baptized in 1922. During his years at Hollywood, Reagan became a member of the Hollywood Beverly Christian Church and attended its services infrequently. Subsequently, from 1964 onwards, Reagan began to attend church services at Bel Air Presbyterian Church, where he became acquainted with Don Mumwa. Reagan scaled down his church attendance while serving as president, citing the inconvenience that his large Secret Service entourage would bring to other churchgoers and the potential danger from his presence due to possible terrorism. After leaving office, Reagan officially joined Bel Air as its member and regularly attended services there. Formal education. Reagan attended Dixon High School, where he developed interests in acting, sports, and storytelling. His first job involved working as a lifeguard at the Rock River in Lowell Park in 1927. Over 6 years, Reagan performed 77 rescues. In 1928, he attended Eureka College. He was an indifferent student, majored in economics and sociology and graduated with a C average. He developed a reputation as a jack of all trades, excelling in campus politics, sports, and theater. He was a member of the football team and of the swim team. He was elected student body president and participated in student protests against the college president. Entertainment career. Radio and film. After graduating from Eureka in 1932, Reagan took jobs in Iowa as a radio announcer at several stations. He moved to Who Radio in Des Moines as an announcer for Chicago Cubs baseball games. His specialty was creating play-by-play accounts of games using only basic descriptions that the station received by wire as the games were in progress. While traveling with the Cubs in California in 1937, Reagan took a screen test that led to a 7-year contract with Warner Brothers Studios. He spent the first few years of his Hollywood career in the B-film unit, where, Reagan joked, "The producers didn't want them good, they wanted them Thursday." He earned his first screen credit with a starring role in the 1937 movie Love Is on the Air, and by the end of 1939, he had appeared in 19 films, including Dark Victory with Bette Davis and Humphrey Bogart. Before the film Santa Fe Trail with Errol Flynn in 1940, he played the role of George Gipp in the film Newt Rockne, All-American. From it, he acquired the lifelong nickname the Gipper. In 1941, exhibitors voted him the fifth most popular star from the younger generation in Hollywood. Reagan played his favorite acting role in 1942's King's Row, where he plays a double amputee who recites the line "Where's the rest of me?" later used as the title of his 1965 autobiography. Many film critics considered King's Row to be his best movie, though the film was condemned by the New York Times critic Bosley Crowther. King's Row made Reagan a star. Warner immediately tripled his salary to $3,000 a week. Shortly afterward, he received CO star above the title billing with Flynn, who was still a huge star at the time in Desperate Journey. In April 1942, Reagan was ordered to military active duty in San Francisco and never quite became a big first-rank film star despite playing the lead in numerous movies. After his wartime military service, he co-starred in such films as The Voice of the Turtle, John Loves Mary, The Hasty Heart, Bedtime for Bonzo, Cattle Queen of Montana, Tennessee's Partner, Hellcats of the Navy, and his one turn at playing a vicious villain, in the 1964 remake The Killers with Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson. Throughout his film career, Reagan's mother answered much of his fan mail. Military service. After completing 14 home study Army extension courses, Reagan enlisted in the Army Enlisted Reserve and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Officers Reserve Corps of the Cavalry on May 25, 1937. On April 18, 1942, Reagan was ordered to active duty for the first time. Because of severe nearsightedness, he was classified for limited service only, which excluded him from serving overseas. His first assignment was at the San Francisco Port of Embarkation at Fort Mason, California, as a liaison officer of the Port and Transportation Office. Upon the approval of the U.S. Army Air Forces, he applied for a transfer from the cavalry to the AAF on May 15, 1942, and was assigned to AAF Public Relations and subsequently to the 18th AAF Base Unit at Culver City, California. On January 14, 1943, he was promoted to first lieutenant and was sent to the Provisional Task Force Show Unit of This Is the Army at Burbank, California. He returned to the 18th AAF Base Unit after completing this duty and was promoted to captain on July 22, 1943. In January 1944, Reagan was ordered to temporary duty in New York City to participate in the opening of the 6th War Loan Drive, which campaigned for the purchase of war bonds. He was reassigned to the 18th AAF Base Unit on November 14, 1944, where he remained until the end of World War II. By the end of the war, his units had produced some 400 training films for the Air Force, including cockpit simulations for B-29 crews scheduled to bomb Japan. He was separated from active duty on December 9, 1945, as an Army captain. While he was in the service, Reagan obtained a film reel depicting the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. He held on to it, believing that doubts would someday arise as to whether the Holocaust had occurred. Screen Actors Guild Presidency. Reagan was first elected to the board of directors of the Screen Actors Guild in 1941, serving as an alternate member. After World War II, he resumed service and became third vice president in 1946. When the SAG president and 6 board members resigned in March 1947 because of the union's new bylaws on conflict of interest, Reagan was elected president in a special election. He was subsequently re-elected 6 times, in 1947, 1948, 1949, 1950, 1951 and 1959. He led the SAG through implementation of the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, various labor management disputes and the Hollywood blacklist era. First instituted in 1947 by studio executives who agreed that they would not employ anyone believed to be or to have been communists or sympathetic with radical politics, the blacklist grew steadily larger during the early 1950s as Congress continued to investigate domestic political subversion. Reagan was instrumental in securing residuals for television actors when their episodes were rerun, and later for motion picture actors when their studio films aired on television. FBI informant. In 1946, Reagan served on the National Board of Directors for the Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions and had been a member of its Hollywood chapter. His attendance at a July 10, 1946 meeting of HICSP brought him to the attention of the FBI, which interviewed him on April 10, 1947 in connection with its investigation into HICSP. 4 decades later, it was revealed that during the late 1940s, Reagan and his wife Jane Wyman provided the FBI with the names of actors within the motion picture industry whom they believed to be communist sympathizers. Even so, he was uncomfortable with the way in which the SAG was being used by the government, asking during one FBI interview, "Do they expect us to constitute ourselves as a little FBI of our own and determine just who is a commie and who isn't?" HUAC's Hollywood hearings. In October 1947 during HUAC's Hollywood hearings, Reagan testified as president of the Screen Actors Guild. There has been a small group within the Screen Actors Guild which has consistently opposed the policy of the Guild Board and officers of the Guild, suspected of more or less following the tactics that we associate with the Communist Party. At times they have attempted to be a disruptive influence. I have heard different discussions and some of them tagged as communists. I found myself misled into being a sponsor on another occasion for a function that was held under the auspices of the Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee. Regarding a jurisdictional strike going on for 7 months at that time, Reagan testified. The first time that this word communist was ever injected into any of the meetings concerning the strike was at a meeting in Chicago with Mr. William Hutchinson, president of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, who were on strike at the time. He asked the Screen Actors Guild to submit terms to Mr. Walsh, for Walsh to give in the settling of this strike, and he told us to tell Mr. Walsh that if he would give in on these terms he, in turn, would run this sorrel and the other commies out. I am quoting him and break it up. However, Reagan also opposed measures soon to manifest in the Mont-Nixon bill in May 1948 by opining, "As a citizen I would hesitate, or not like, to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its political ideology. I abhor their philosophy, but I detest more than that their tactics, which are those of the fifth column, and are dishonest, but at the same time I never as a citizen want to see our country become urged, by either fear or resentment of this group, that we ever compromise with any of our democratic principles through that fear or resentment." Further, when asked whether he was aware of communist efforts within the Screenwriters Guild, Reagan would not play along, saying, "Sir, like the other gentlemen, I must say that is hearsay." Television. Reagan landed fewer film roles in the late 1950s and moved into television. He was hired as the host of General Electric Theater, a series of weekly dramas that became very popular. His contract required him to tour General Electric plants 16 weeks out of the year, which often demanded that he give 14 talks per day. He earned approximately $125,000 in this role. The show ran for 10 seasons from 1953 to 1962, which increased Reagan's national profile. On January 1, 1959, Reagan was the host and announcer for ABC's coverage of the Tournament of Roses parade. In his final work as a professional actor, Reagan was a host and performer from 1964 to 1965 on the television series Death Valley Days. Following their marriage in 1952, Ronald and Nancy Reagan, who continued to use the stage name Nancy Davis, acted together in 3 TV series episodes, including a 1958 installment of General Electric Theater titled A Turkey for the President. Marriages and Children. In 1938, Reagan co-starred in the film Brother Rat with actress Jane Wyman. They announced their engagement at the Chicago Theater and married on January 26, 1940, at the Weekirk the Heather Church in Glendale, California. Together they had 2 biological daughters, Maureen and Christine, and adopted a son, Michael. After the couple had arguments about Reagan's political ambitions, Wyman filed for divorce in 1948, citing a distraction due to her husband's Screen Actors Guild union duties. The divorce was finalized in 1949. Wyman, who was a registered Republican, also stated that their breakup stemmed from a difference in politics. When Reagan became president 32 years later, he became the first divorced person to assume the nation's highest office. Reagan and Wyman continued to be friends until his death. Wyman voted for Reagan in both his runs, and on his death she said, "America has lost a great president and a great, kind, and gentle man." Reagan met actress Nancy Davis in 1949 after she contacted him in his capacity as president of the Screen Actors Guild. He helped her with issues regarding her name appearing on a communist blacklist in Hollywood. She had been mistaken for another Nancy Davis. She described their meeting by saying, "I don't know if it was exactly love at first sight, but it was pretty close." They were engaged at Chasen's restaurant in Los Angeles and were married on March 4, 1952, at the Little Brown Church in the San Fernando Valley. Actor William Holden served as best man at the ceremony. They had 2 children, Patty and Ronald Ron. The couple's relationship was close, authentic, and intimate. During his presidency, they often displayed affection for each other. One press secretary said, "They never took each other for granted. They never stopped courting." He often called her Mommy, and she called him Ronnie. He once wrote to her, "Whatever I treasure and enjoy, all would be without meaning if I didn't have you." In 1998, while he was stricken by Alzheimer's, Nancy told Vanity Fair, "Our relationship is very special. We were very much in love and still are. When I say my life began with Ronnie, well, it's true. It did. I can't imagine life without him." Nancy Reagan died on March 6, 2016, at the age of 94. Early political career. Reagan began as a Hollywood Democrat, and Franklin D. Roosevelt was a true hero to him. He moved to the right wing in the 1950s, became a Republican in 1962, and emerged as a leading conservative spokesman in the Goldwater campaign of 1964. In his early political career, he joined numerous political committees with a left-wing orientation, such as the American Veterans Committee. He fought against Republican-sponsored right-to-work legislation and supported Helen Gahagan Douglas in 1950 when she was defeated for the Senate by Richard Nixon. It was his belief that communists were a powerful backstage influence in those groups that led him to rally his friends against them. At rallies, Reagan frequently spoke with a strong ideological dimension. In December 1945, he was stopped from leading an anti-nuclear rally in Hollywood by pressure from the Warner Brothers studio. He would later make nuclear weapons a key point of his presidency when he specifically stated his opposition to mutual assured destruction. Reagan also built on previous efforts to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. In the 1948 presidential election, Reagan strongly supported Harry S. Truman and appeared on stage with him during a campaign speech in Los Angeles. In the early 1950s, his relationship with actress Nancy Davis grew, and he shifted to the right when he endorsed the presidential candidacies of Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. Reagan was hired by General Electric in 1954 to host the General Electric Theater, a weekly TV drama series. He also traveled across the country to give motivational speeches to over 200,000 GE employees. His many speeches, which he wrote himself, were nonpartisan but carried a conservative, pro-business message. He was influenced by Lemuel Boulware, a senior GE executive. Boulware, known for his tough stance against unions and his innovative strategies to win over workers, championed the core tenets of modern American conservatism: free markets, anti-communism, lower taxes, and limited government. Eager for a larger stage, but not allowed to enter politics by GE, Reagan quit and formally registered as a Republican. He often said, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The party left me." When the legislation that would become Medicare was introduced in 1961, he created a recording for the American Medical Association warning that such legislation would mean the end of freedom in America. Reagan said that if his listeners did not write letters to prevent it, we will awake to find that we have socialism. And if you don't do this, and if I don't do it, one of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children, and our children's children, what it once was like in America when men were free. Other Democratic initiatives he opposed in the 1960s included the food stamp program, raising the minimum wage, and the establishment of the Peace Corps. He also joined the National Rifle Association and would become a lifetime member. Reagan gained national attention in his speeches for conservative presidential contender Barry Goldwater in 1964. Speaking for Goldwater, Reagan stressed his belief in the importance of smaller government. He consolidated themes that he had developed in his talks for GE to deliver his famous speech, "A Time for Choosing." The Founding Fathers knew a government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they knew when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. So we have come to a time for choosing. You and I are told we must choose between a left or right, but I suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There is only an up or down. Up to man's age-old dream, the maximum of individual freedom consistent with order, or down to the ant heap of totalitarianism. This "A Time for Choosing" speech was not enough to turn around the faltering Goldwater campaign, but it was the crucial event that established Reagan's national political visibility. David Broder of The Washington Post called it the most successful national political debut since William Jennings Bryan electrified the 1896 Democratic Convention with his Cross of Gold speech. Governor of California. California Republicans were impressed with Reagan's political views and charisma after his "Time for Choosing" speech, and in late 1965 he announced his campaign for governor in the 1966 election. He defeated former San Francisco Mayor George Christopher in the Republican primary. In Reagan's campaign, he emphasized two main themes: to send the welfare bums back to work, and, in reference to burgeoning anti-war and anti-establishment student protests at the University of California, Berkeley, to clean up the mess at Berkeley. In 1966, Reagan accomplished what both U.S. Senator William Knowland in 1958 and former Vice President Richard Nixon in 1962 failed to do: he was elected, defeating Pat Brown, the Democratic two-term governor. Reagan was sworn in on January 2, 1967. In his first term, he froze government hiring and approved tax hikes to balance the budget. Shortly after assuming office, Reagan tested the 1968 presidential waters as part of a Stop Nixon movement, hoping to cut into Nixon's Southern support and become a compromise candidate if neither Nixon nor second-place candidate Nelson Rockefeller received enough delegates to win on the first ballot at the Republican convention. However, by the time of the convention, Nixon had 692 delegate votes, 25 more than he needed to secure the nomination, followed by Rockefeller with Reagan in third place. Reagan was involved in several high-profile conflicts with the protest movements of the era, including his public criticism of university administrators for tolerating student demonstrations at the Berkeley campus. On May 15, 1969, during the People's Park protests at the university's campus, Reagan sent the California Highway Patrol and other officers to quell the protests. This led to an incident that became known as Bloody Thursday, resulting in the death of student James Rector and the blinding of carpenter Alan Blanchard. In addition, 111 police officers were injured in the conflict, including one who was knifed in the chest. Reagan then called out 2,200 state National Guard troops to occupy the city of Berkeley for 2 weeks to crack down on the protesters. The Guard remained in Berkeley for 17 days, camping in People's Park, and demonstrations subsided as the university removed cordoned-off fencing and placed all development plans for People's Park on hold. 1 year after the incident, Reagan responded to questions about campus protest movements saying, "If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement." When the Symbionese Liberation Army kidnapped Patty Hearst in Berkeley and demanded the distribution of food to the poor, Reagan joked to a group of political aides about a botulism outbreak contaminating the food. Early in 1967, the national debate on abortion was starting to gain traction. In the early stages of the debate, Democratic California State Senator Anthony Bielenson introduced the Therapeutic Abortion Act in an effort to reduce the number of backroom abortions performed in California. The state legislature sent the bill to Reagan's desk where, after many days of indecision, he reluctantly signed it on June 14, 1967. About 2 million abortions would be performed as a result, mostly because of a provision in the bill allowing abortions for the well-being of the mother. Reagan had been in office for only 4 months when he signed the bill and later stated that had he been more experienced as governor, he would not have signed it. After he recognized what he called the consequences of the bill, he announced that he was anti-abortion. He maintained that position later in his political career, writing extensively about abortion. In 1967, Reagan signed the Mulford Act, which repealed a law allowing the public carrying of loaded firearms. The bill, which was named after Republican Assemblyman Don Mulford, garnered national attention after the Black Panthers marched bearing arms upon the California state capitol to protest it. Despite an unsuccessful attempt to force a recall election on Reagan in 1968, he was re-elected governor in 1970. Defeating Jesse M. Unruh. He chose not to seek a third term in the following election cycle. One of Reagan's greatest frustrations in office was the controversy of capital punishment, which he strongly supported. His efforts to enforce the state's laws in this area were thwarted when the Supreme Court of California issued its People v. Anderson decision, which invalidated all death sentences issued in California before 1972. Though the decision was later overturned by a constitutional amendment. The only execution during Reagan's governorship was on April 12, 1967, when Aaron Mitchell's sentence was carried out by the state in San Quintin's gas chamber. In 1969, Reagan signed the Family Law Act, which was an amalgam of 2 bills that had been written and revised by the California state legislature over more than 2 years. It became the first no-fault divorce legislation in the United States. Years later, he told his son Michael that signing that law was his greatest regret in public life. Reagan's terms as governor helped to shape the policies he would pursue in his later political career as president. By campaigning on a platform of sending the welfare bums back to work, he spoke out against the idea of the welfare state. He also strongly advocated the Republican ideal of less government regulation of the economy, including that of undue federal taxation. 1976 Presidential Campaign. Reagan's 1976 campaign relied on a strategy crafted by campaign manager John Sears of winning a few primaries early to damage the inevitability of Gerald Ford's likely nomination. Reagan won North Carolina, Texas, and California, but the strategy failed, as he ended up losing New Hampshire, Florida, and his native Illinois. The Texas campaign lent renewed hope to Reagan when he swept all 96 delegates chosen in the May 1 primary, with 4 more awaiting at the state convention. Much of the credit for that victory came from the work of 3 CO chairmen, including Ernest Angelo, the mayor of Midland, and Ray Barnhart of Houston, whom Reagan as president would appoint in 1981 as director of the Federal Highway Administration. However, as the GOP convention neared, Ford appeared close to victory. Acknowledging his party's moderate wing, Reagan chose moderate Senator Richard Schweiker of Pennsylvania as his running mate if nominated. Nonetheless, Ford prevailed with 1,187 delegates to Reagan's 1,070. Reagan's concession speech emphasized the dangers of nuclear war and the threat posed by the Soviet Union. Though he lost the nomination, he received 307 write-in votes in New Hampshire, 388 votes as an independent on Wyoming's ballot, and a single electoral vote from a faithless elector in the November election from the state of Washington. 1978 – Opposition to the Briggs Initiative. In 1978, conservative state legislator John Briggs sponsored a ballot initiative for the November 7, 1978 California state election that sought to ban gays and lesbians from working in California's public schools. Officially, California Proposition 6 was a ballot initiative put to referendum on the state ballot. Early opposition was led by LGBT activists and a few progressive politicians, but to many people's surprise, Reagan moved to publicly oppose the measure. He issued an informal letter of opposition to the initiative, told reporters that he was opposed, and wrote an editorial in the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner opposing it. The timing of Reagan's opposition was significant, and surprised many, because he was then preparing to run for president, a race in which he would need the support of conservatives and those moderates who were uncomfortable with homosexual teachers. At that very moment, he was actively courting leaders from the religious right, including Jerry Falwell, who would go on to form the moral majority to fight out such culture war issues the following year. As Reagan biographer Lou Cannon puts it, Reagan was well aware that there were those who wanted him to duck the issue but nevertheless chose to state his convictions. Cannon reports that Reagan was repelled by the aggressive public crusades against homosexual lifestyles which became a staple of right-wing politics in the late 1970s. Reagan's November 1 editorial stated, in part, "Whatever else it is, homosexuality is not a contagious disease like the measles." Prevailing scientific opinion is that an individual's sexuality is determined at a very early age and that a child's teachers do not really influence this. 1980 Presidential Campaign. The 1980 presidential election featured Reagan against incumbent President Jimmy Carter and was conducted amid a multitude of domestic concerns as well as the ongoing Iran hostage crisis. Reagan's campaign stressed some of his fundamental principles: lower taxes to stimulate the economy, less government interference in people's lives, states' rights, and a strong national defense. Reagan launched his campaign with an indictment of a federal government that he believed had overspent, overstimulated, and overregulated. After receiving the Republican nomination, Reagan selected one of his opponents from the primaries, George H. W. Bush, to be his running mate. His relaxed and confident appearance during the televised Reagan-Carter debate on October 28 boosted his popularity and helped to widen his lead in the polls. On November 4, Reagan won a decisive victory over Carter, carrying 44 states and receiving 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49 in 6 states plus D.C. He also won the popular vote, receiving 50.7% to Carter's 41.0%. with independent John B. Anderson garnering 6.6%. Republicans also won a majority of seats in the Senate for the first time since 1952, though Democrats retained a majority in the House of Representatives. Presidency. During his presidency, Reagan pursued policies that reflected his personal belief in individual freedom, brought economic changes, expanded the military and contributed to the end of the Cold War. Termed the Reagan Revolution, his presidency would boost American morale, reinvigorate the U.S. economy and reduce reliance upon government. As president, Reagan kept a diary in which he commented on daily occurrences of his presidency and his views on the issues of the day. The diaries were published in May 2007 in the best-selling book The Reagan Diaries. First term. Reagan was 69 years, 349 days of age when he was sworn into office for his first term on January 20, 1981, making him the oldest first-term president at the time. He held this distinction until 2017, when Donald Trump was inaugurated at age 70 years, 220 days, though Reagan was older upon being inaugurated for his second term. In his inaugural address, he addressed the country's economic malaise, arguing, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem." Prayer in schools in a moment of silence. Assassination attempt. Sandra Day O'Connor. Air traffic controllers strike. Reaganomics and the economy. Civil rights. Escalation of the Cold War. Lebanese Civil War. Invasion of Grenada. 1984 presidential campaign. Second term. Reagan was sworn in as president for the second time on January 20, 1985, in a private ceremony at the White House. At the time, the 73-year-old Reagan was the oldest person to take the presidential oath of office. This record was later surpassed by Joe Biden, who was 78 at his inauguration in 2021. Because January 20 fell on a Sunday, a public celebration was not held but took place in the Capitol Rotunda the following day. January 21 was one of the coldest days on record in Washington, D.C., due to poor weather. Inaugural celebrations were held inside the Capitol. In the weeks that followed, Reagan shook up his staff somewhat, moving White House Chief of Staff James Baker to Secretary of the Treasury and naming Treasury Secretary Ronald Reagan, a former Merrill Lynch officer, Chief of Staff. War on drugs. Response to AIDS epidemic. Addressing apartheid. Libya bombing. Immigration. Iran-Contra affair. Decline of the Soviet Union and thaw in relations. Health. Early in his presidency, Reagan started wearing a custom-made, technologically advanced hearing aid, first in his right ear and later in his left ear as well. His decision to go public in 1983 regarding his wearing the small, audio-amplifying device boosted their sales. On July 13, 1985, Reagan underwent surgery at Bethesda Naval Hospital to remove a section of his colon due to colorectal cancer. He relinquished presidential power to the vice president for 8 hours in a similar procedure as outlined in the 25th Amendment, which he specifically avoided invoking. The surgery lasted just under 3 hours and was successful. Reagan resumed the powers of the presidency later that day. In August of that year, he underwent an operation to remove skin cancer cells from his nose. In October, more skin cancer cells were detected on his nose and removed. In January 1987, Reagan underwent surgery for an enlarged prostate that caused further worries about his health. No cancerous growths were found, and he was not sedated during the operation. In July of that year, aged 76, he underwent a third skin cancer operation on his nose. On January 7, 1989, Reagan underwent surgery at Walter Reed Army Medical Center to repair a Dupuytren's contracture of the ring finger of his left hand. The surgery lasted for more than 3 hours and was performed under regional anesthesia. On September 8, 1989, Reagan underwent surgery in Rochester, Minnesota to remove fluid from his brain due to an injury from falling off a horse on the 4th of July earlier that year. The procedure was done by doctors from the Mayo Clinic, lasted just over an hour, and was performed under general anesthesia. Judiciary. During the 1980 presidential campaign, Reagan pledged that he would appoint the first female Supreme Court justice if given the opportunity. That opportunity came during his first year in office when Associate Justice Potter Stewart retired. Reagan selected Sandra Day O'Connor, who was confirmed unanimously by the Senate. In his second term, Reagan had 3 opportunities to fill a Supreme Court vacancy. When Chief Justice Warren E. Burger retired in September 1986, Reagan nominated incumbent Associate Justice William Rehnquist to succeed Burger as Chief Justice. Then, following Rehnquist's confirmation, the President named Antonin Scalia to fill the consequent Associate Justice vacancy. Reagan's final opportunity to fill a vacancy arose in mid-1987 when Associate Justice Lewis F. Powell, Jr. announced his intention to retire. Reagan initially chose conservative jurist Robert Bork to succeed Powell. Bork's nomination was strongly opposed by civil and women's rights groups, and by Senate Democrats. That October, after a contentious Senate debate, the nomination was rejected by a roll call vote of 42-58. Soon afterward, Reagan announced his intention to nominate Douglas Ginsburg to the court. However, before his name was submitted to the Senate, Ginsburg withdrew himself from consideration. Anthony Kennedy was subsequently nominated and confirmed as Powell's successor. Along with his 4 Supreme Court appointments, Reagan appointed 83 judges to the United States Courts of Appeals, and 290 judges to the United States District Courts. Early in his presidency, Reagan appointed Clarence M. Pendleton, Jr. of San Diego as the first African American to chair the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Pendleton tried to steer the commission into a conservative direction in line with Reagan's views on social and civil rights policy during his tenure from 1981 until his sudden death in 1988. Pendleton soon aroused the ire of many civil rights advocates and feminists when he ridiculed the comparable Worth proposal as being Looney Tunes. Post-presidency. Public speaking. After leaving office in 1989, the Reagans purchased a home in Bel Air, Los Angeles, in addition to the Reagan Ranch in Santa Barbara. They regularly attended Bel Air Church and occasionally gave speeches and made appearances on behalf of the Republican Party. Reagan delivered a well-received speech at the 1992 Republican National Convention. Previously, on November 4, 1991, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library was dedicated and opened to the public. 5 presidents and 6 first ladies attended the dedication ceremonies, marking the first time that 5 presidents were gathered in the same location. On November 15, 1990, Reagan's autobiography, An American Life, was released. Reagan continued to speak publicly in favor of the Brady Bill, a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget, and the repeal of the 22nd Amendment, which prohibits anyone from serving more than 2 terms as president. In 1992, Reagan established the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award with the newly formed Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. His final public speech occurred on February 3, 1994, during a tribute to him in Washington, D.C. His last major public appearance was at the funeral of Richard Nixon on April 27, 1994. Assault. On April 13, 1992, Reagan was assaulted by an anti-nuclear protester during a luncheon speech while accepting an award from the National Association of Broadcasters in Las Vegas. The protester, Richard Springer, smashed a 2-foot-high, 30-pound crystal statue of an eagle that the broadcasters had given the former president. Flying shards of glass hit Reagan, but he was not injured. Using media credentials, Springer intended to announce government plans for an underground nuclear weapons test in the Nevada desert the following day. Springer was the founder of an anti-nuclear group called the 100th Monkey. Following his arrest on assault charges, a Secret Service spokesman could not explain how Springer got past the federal agents who guarded Reagan's life at all times. Later, Springer pleaded guilty to reduced charges and said he had not meant to hurt Reagan through his actions. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor federal charge of interfering with the Secret Service, but other felony charges of assault and resisting officers were dropped. Alzheimer's disease. Announcement and reaction. Progression. Death and funeral. Reagan died of pneumonia, complicated by Alzheimer's disease, at his home in the Bel Air district of Los Angeles, California, on the afternoon of June 5, 2004. A short time after his death, Nancy Reagan released a statement, saying, "My family and I would like the world to know that President Ronald Reagan has passed away after 10 years of Alzheimer's disease at 93 years of age. We appreciate everyone's prayers." Speaking in Paris, France, President George W. Bush called Reagan's death a sad hour in the life of America. He also declared June 11 a national day of mourning. Reagan's body was taken to the Kingsley and Gates Funeral Home in Santa Monica, California, where well-wishers paid tribute by laying flowers and American flags in the grass. On June 7, his body was transferred to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, where a brief family funeral, conducted by Pastor Michael Wenning, was held. Reagan's body lay in repose in the library lobby until June 9. Over 100,000 people viewed the coffin. On June 9, Reagan's body was flown to Washington, D.C., where he became the 10th U.S. president to lie in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. In 34 hours, 104,684 people filed past the coffin. On June 11, a state funeral was conducted in the Washington National Cathedral, presided over by President George W. Bush. Eulogies were given by former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and both former President George H. W. Bush and President George W. Bush. Also in attendance were Mikhail Gorbachev and many world leaders, including British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Prince Charles, representing his mother Queen Elizabeth II, German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, and interim Presidents Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan and Ghazi al-Ya'ar of Iraq. After the funeral, the Reagan entourage was flown back to the Ronald W. Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, where another service was held, and President Reagan was interred. At the time of his death, Reagan was the longest-lived president in U.S. history, having lived 93 years and 120 days. He was also the first U.S. president to die in the 21st century. Reagan's burial site is inscribed with the words he delivered at the opening of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, "I know in my heart that man is good, that what is right will always eventually triumph, and that there is purpose and worth to each and every life." Cultural and political image. According to columnist Chuck Rosh, Reagan transformed the American presidency in ways that only a few have been able to. Reagan's avuncular style, optimism, and plain folks demeanor also helped him turn government bashing into an art form. He redefined the political agenda of the times, advocating lower taxes, novel and controversial economic policies, and a stronger military. When Reagan left office in 1989, a CBS poll indicated that he held an approval rating of 68%. This figure equaled the approval rating of Franklin D. Roosevelt, as the highest rating for a departing president in the modern era. Gallup polls in 2001, 2007 and 2011 ranked him number 1 or number 2 when correspondents were asked for the greatest president in history. Reagan ranked third of post-World War II presidents in a 2007 Rasmussen Reports poll, 5th in a 2000 ABC poll, 9th in another 2007 Rasmussen poll, and 8th in a late 2008 poll by British newspaper The Times. In a Siena College survey of over 200 historians, however, Reagan ranked 16th out of 42. The 2021 annual C-SPAN survey of presidential leaders ranked Reagan the 9th greatest president, an improvement from 11th out of 41 in 2000. In 2011, the Institute for the Study of the Americas released the first ever British academic survey to rate U.S. presidents. This poll of British specialists in U.S. history and politics placed Reagan as the 8th greatest U.S. president. Reagan's ability to talk about substantive issues with understandable terms and to focus on mainstream American concerns earned him the laudatory moniker the Great Communicator. Of it, Reagan said, "I won the nickname the Great Communicator. But I never thought it was my style that made a difference, it was the content. I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things." His age and soft-spoken speech gave him a warm grandfatherly image. Reagan also earned the nickname the Teflon President, in that public perceptions of him were not tarnished by the controversies that arose during his administration. According to Colorado Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder, who coined the phrase, the epithet referred to Reagan's ability to do almost anything and not get blamed for it. Reagan was the oldest president up to that time and was supported by young voters, an allegiance that shifted many of them to the Republican Party. Reagan did not fare well with minority groups in terms of approval, especially African Americans. He emphasized family values in his campaigns and during his presidency, although he was the first president to have been divorced. The combination of Reagan's speaking style, unabashed patriotism, negotiation skills, as well as his savvy use of the media, played an important role in defining the 1980s and his future legacy. Reagan was known to joke frequently during his lifetime, displayed humor throughout his presidency, and was famous for his storytelling. His numerous jokes and one-liners have been labeled classic quips and legendary. Among the most notable of his jokes was one regarding the Cold War. As a microphone test in preparation for his weekly radio address in August 1984, Reagan made the following joke: "My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." Reagan's sense of humor was also observed by hundreds of Americans at Tempelhof U.S. Air Base June 12, 1987. While giving a speech celebrating the 750th anniversary of Berlin, a balloon popped in the front row. Without missing a beat, Reagan quipped, "Missed me," a reference to his previous assassination attempt in 1981. Former aide David Gergen commented, "It was that humor that I think endeared people to Reagan." Reagan also had the ability to offer comfort and hope to the nation as a whole at times of tragedy. Following the disintegration of the Space Shuttle Challenger on January 28, 1986. On the evening of the disaster, Reagan addressed the nation, saying, "The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." Legacy. Since Reagan left office in 1989, substantial debate has occurred among scholars, historians, and the general public surrounding his legacy. Supporters have pointed to a more efficient and prosperous economy as a result of Reagan's economic policies, foreign policy triumphs including a peaceful end to the Cold War, and a restoration of American pride and morale. Proponents say that he had an unabated and passionate love for the United States which restored faith in the American dream after a decline in American confidence and self-respect under Jimmy Carter's perceived weak leadership, particularly during the Iran hostage crisis, as well as his gloomy, dreary outlook for the future of the United States during the 1980 election. Critics point out that Reagan's economic policies resulted in rising budget deficits, a wider gap in wealth, and an increase in homelessness, and that the Iran-Contra affair lowered American credibility. Opinions of Reagan's legacy among the country's leading policymakers and journalists differ as well. Edwin Foylner, president of the Heritage Foundation, said that Reagan helped create a safer, freer world and said of his economic policies, he took in America suffering from malaise, and made its citizens believe again in their destiny. However, Mark Weisbrot, CO director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, contended that Reagan's economic policies were mostly a failure, while Howard Kurtz of the Washington Post opined that Reagan was a far more controversial figure in his time than the largely gushing obits on television would suggest. Despite the continuing debate surrounding his legacy, many conservative and liberal scholars agree that Reagan has been the most influential president since Franklin D. Roosevelt, leaving his imprint on American politics, diplomacy, culture, and economics through his effective communication and pragmatic compromising. As summarized by British historian M. J. Heal, since Reagan left office, historians have reached a broad consensus that he rehabilitated conservatism, turned the nation to the right, practiced a considerably pragmatic conservatism that balanced ideology and the constraints of politics, revived faith in the presidency and American exceptionalism, and contributed to victory in the Cold War. In 2017, a C-SPAN survey of scholars ranked Reagan in terms of leadership in comparison with all 42 presidents. He ranked number 9 in international relations. Cold War. After 40 years of high tension, the USSR pulled back in the last years of Reagan's second term. In 1989, the Kremlin lost control of all its East European satellites. In 1991, communism was overthrown in the USSR, and on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. As a result, this left the United States as the world's only superpower. Reagan's exact role in the USSR's collapse is debated, with many proponents believing that Reagan's defense policies, economic policies, military policies, and hardline rhetoric against the Soviet Union and communism together with his summits with General Secretary Gorbachev played a significant part in ending the Cold War. He was the first president to reject containment and détente and to put into practice the concept that the Soviet Union could be defeated rather than simply negotiated with, a post-détente strategy, a conviction that was vindicated by Gennady Gerasimov, the foreign ministry spokesman under Gorbachev, who said that the Strategic Defense Initiative was very successful blackmail. The Soviet economy couldn't endure such competition. Reagan's aggressive rhetoric toward the USSR had mixed effects. Jeffrey W. Knopf observes that being labeled evil probably made no difference to the Soviets but gave encouragement to the East European citizens opposed to communism. General Secretary Gorbachev said of his former rival's Cold War role, a man who was instrumental in bringing about the end of the Cold War, and deemed him a great president. Gorbachev does not acknowledge a win or loss in the war, but rather a peaceful end. He said he was not intimidated by Reagan's harsh rhetoric. Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, said of Reagan, he warned that the Soviet Union had an insatiable drive for military power, but he also sensed it was being eaten away by systemic failures impossible to reform. She later said, Ronald Reagan had a higher claim than any other leader to have won the Cold War for liberty, and he did it without a shot being fired. Said Brian Mulroney, former Prime Minister of Canada, he enters history as a strong and dramatic player in the Cold War. Former President Lech Walesa of Poland acknowledged, Reagan was one of the world leaders who made a major contribution to communism's collapse. Professor Jeffrey Knopf has argued that Reagan's leadership was only one of several causes of the end of the Cold War. President Harry S. Truman's policy of containment is also regarded as a force behind the fall of the USSR, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan undermined the Soviet system itself. Domestic and political legacy. Reagan reshaped the Republican Party, led the modern conservative movement, and altered the political dynamic of the United States. Since Reagan's presidency, conservatism has been the dominant ideology of the GOP, displacing the party's liberal-moderate faction. More men voted Republican under Reagan, and Reagan tapped into religious voters. The so-called Reagan Democrats were a result of his presidency. After leaving office, Reagan became an iconic influence within the Republican Party. His policies and beliefs have been frequently invoked by Republican presidential candidates since 1988. The 2008 Republican presidential candidates were no exception, for they aimed to liken themselves to him during the primary debates, even imitating his campaign strategies. Republican nominee John McCain frequently said that he came to office as a foot soldier in the Reagan Revolution. Reagan's most famous statement regarding the role of smaller government was that government is not a solution to our problem, government is the problem. Washington Post reporter Carlos Lozada noted Donald Trump's praising of Reagan in a book he published during his 2016 presidential campaign. The period of American history most dominated by Reagan and his policies that concerned taxes, welfare, defense, the federal judiciary and the Cold War is known today as the Reagan era. This time period emphasized that the conservative Reagan Revolution, led by Reagan, had a permanent impact on the United States in domestic and foreign policy. The Bill Clinton administration is often treated as an extension of the Reagan era, as is the George W. Bush administration. Historian Eric Foner noted that the Obama candidacy in 2008 aroused a great deal of wishful thinking among those yearning for a change after nearly 30 years of Reaganism. Honors. Reagan received several awards in his pre- and post-presidential years. After his election as president, Reagan received a lifetime gold membership in the Screen Actors Guild, was inducted into the National Speakers Association Speaker Hall of Fame, and received the United States Military Academy's Sylvanus Thayer Award. In 1981, Reagan was inducted as a laureate of the Lincoln Academy of Illinois and awarded the Order of Lincoln by the Governor of Illinois in the area of government. In 1982 he was given the Distinguished Service Medal by the American Legion because his highest priority was the national defense. In 1983, he received the highest distinction of the Scout Association of Japan, the Golden Pheasant Award. In 1989, Reagan was made an honorary Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, one of the highest British orders. This entitled him to the use of the post-nominal letters GCB but, as a foreign national, not to be known as Sir Ronald Reagan. Only 2 U.S. presidents have received this honor since attaining office, Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Dwight D. Eisenhower received his before becoming president in his capacity as a general after World War II. Reagan was also named an honorary fellow of Keble College, Oxford. Japan awarded him the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Chrysanthemum in 1989. He was the second U.S. president to receive the order and the first to have it given to him for personal reasons, as Eisenhower received it as a commemoration of U.S. Japanese relations. On September 3, 1990, Reagan was awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. In November 1992, on the third anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, he received honorary citizenship of Berlin to commemorate his famous speech in front of the wall in 1987 and his policies that contributed significantly to the end of the Cold War. On January 18, 1993, Reagan received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor that the United States can bestow, from President George H.W. Bush, his vice president and successor. Reagan was also awarded the Republican Senatorial Medal of Freedom, the highest honor bestowed by Republican members of the Senate. On Reagan's 87th birthday in 1998, Washington National Airport was renamed Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport by a bill signed into law by President Bill Clinton. That year, the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center was dedicated in Washington, D.C. He was among 18 included in Gallup's Most Admired Man and Woman poll of the 20th century, from a poll conducted in the U.S. in 1999. 2 years later, USS Ronald Reagan was christened by Nancy Reagan and the United States Navy. It is one of few Navy ships christened in honor of a living person and the first aircraft carrier to be named in honor of a living former president. In 1998, the U.S. Navy Memorial Foundation awarded Reagan its Naval Heritage Award for his support of the U.S. Navy and military in both his film career and while he served as president. Congress authorized the creation of the Ronald Reagan Boyhood Home in Dixon, Illinois in 2002, pending federal purchase of the property. On May 16 of that year, Nancy Reagan accepted the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor bestowed by Congress, on behalf of the President and herself. After Reagan's death, the United States Postal Service issued a President Ronald Reagan commemorative postage stamp in 2005. Later in the year, CNN, along with the editors of Time magazine, named him the most fascinating person of the network's first 25 years. Time listed Reagan one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century as well. The Discovery Channel asked its viewers to vote for the greatest American in June 2005. Reagan placed in first place, ahead of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. In 2006, Reagan was inducted into the California Hall of Fame, located at the California Museum. Every year from 2002, California Governors Gray Davis and Arnold Schwarzenegger proclaimed February 6 Ronald Reagan Day in the state of California in honor of their most famous predecessor. In 2010, Schwarzenegger signed Senate Bill 944, authored by Senator George Runner, to make every February 6 Ronald Reagan Day in California. In 2007, Polish President Lech Kaczynski posthumously conferred on Reagan the highest Polish distinction, the Order of the White Eagle, saying that Reagan had inspired the Polish people to work for change and help to unseat the repressive communist regime. Kaczynski said it would not have been possible if it was not for the tough-mindedness, determination, and feeling of mission of President Ronald Reagan. Reagan backed the nation of Poland throughout his presidency, supporting the anti-communist solidarity movement, along with Pope John Paul II. The Ronald Reagan Park, a public facility in Gdansk, was named in his honor. On June 3, 2009, Nancy Reagan unveiled a statue of her late husband in the United States Capitol Rotunda. The statue represents the state of California in the National Statuary Hall collection. After Reagan's death, both major American political parties agreed to erect a statue of Reagan in the place of that of Thomas Starr King. The day before, President Obama signed the Ronald Reagan Centennial Commission Act into law, establishing a commission to plan activities to mark the upcoming centenary of Reagan's birth. On Independence Day 2011, a statue to Reagan was unveiled outside the U.S. Embassy in London. The unveiling was supposed to be attended by Reagan's wife Nancy, but she did not attend. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice took her place and read a statement on her behalf. President Reagan's friend and British Prime Minister during his presidency, Margaret Thatcher, was also unable to attend due to frail health. In November 2018, a feature film named Reagan received funding from TriStar Global Entertainment with Dennis Quaid portraying Reagan. This would be the second time Quaid portrayed a U.S. president. Reagan was scheduled to begin filming in May 2020, but was postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Gallery. See also: Cultural depictions of Ronald Reagan. List of Presidents of the United States. Electoral history of Ronald Reagan. 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 Reagan administration scandals. Citations. General sources. Further reading. Primary sources. Historiography. Johns, Andrew L., ed. A Companion to Ronald Reagan. 682 pages, Topical essays by scholars emphasizing historiography, contents free at many libraries. Kengor, Paul. Reagan among the professors, his surprising reputation. Policy Review 98, 15+. Reports that many articles in the top journals have been fair, as have a number of influential books, from respected historians, presidential scholars, and political scientists, people who were not Reagan supporters and are certainly not right-wingers. External links. Official sites. Ronald Reagan Foundation and Presidential Library. White House biography. Ronald Reagan and his legacy at Eureka College.